There's one last environment variable that we have to set up, the PG password. This environment variable is a password that's going to be used to get access to our database. Now, one thing I want to be really clear about right now is that the password is tied to Postgres itself. This is not a password related to Docker or Kubernetes or anything like that. We are talking about just getting access to Postgres. We need to make sure that we add in this environment variable and pass it to the multi-server. But like I said in the last video, chances are that we do not want to write out our password in plain text and store it inside of our config file. So rather than adding in our password as plain text or anything like that, we're going to use a new type of object inside of Kubernetes that we have not yet discussed. So the new type of object we're going to use is something called a secret. So it's a very similar type of object in the sense that we had previously created a pod, a deployment, a service, and so on. The purpose of a secret is to securely store one or more pieces of information inside of your cluster. So a good example of a use of a secret would be for a database password, an API key, or maybe an SSH key, or any similar type of secret piece of information that you do not want to have easily exposed to the outside world, but you do want to make available to run in containers inside of your application. And so our database password perfectly qualifies as something that we would want to store inside a secret. Now, the secret is only about information that you want to very much protect. So in our example of our environment variables here, storing the Redis host right here would have not been a very good use of a secret, because the Redis host is always going to be the name of our service. And the name of our service is very plainly legible and readable inside of our Redis cluster IP file right here. So not a good reason to try to store the Redis host, for example, inside of a secret. Probably the same thing for the port. Now, maybe the PG user would be something to store inside of a secret. Maybe the PG database would be as well. But for our example here, we're just going to worry about encoding our PG password and storing it inside of a secret. All right, so how do we create a secret? Well, a secret is an object, very much like a pod, a deployment, a service. And so we have said a billion times throughout this course that we always create an object through the use of a config file. However, you and I are not going to use a config file to create a secret. Instead, we are going to run an imperative command that's going to create the secret for us. So why are we using an imperative command here as opposed to a config file? Well, when you create the secret, you have to provide the data that you want to encode. And so if we had to write out a config file that said, hey, here's our secret, like in plain text, here's the PG password, then it would kind of defeat the purpose of having a secret anyways. So we're going to create our secret with a single command that's going to be imperative in nature. And that means that we're going to have to run this command locally on our computer to create the secret. It also means that when we eventually take our application to a production environment, we're going to have to make sure that we create the secret manually in the production environment as well. Everything else that we've done with the config file, such as our deployments and our services, do not need to be manually created in a production environment. All we have to do is apply the config files that represent each of them. So again, our secret being imperative in nature, we're going to have to make sure that we manually create this thing in any environment that we eventually take our application to. So to create the secret, we're going to run a rather long kubectl command. I'm going to zoom in on this thing and then we'll go over it step by step. So we're going to use kubectl create. Create is an imperative command that we can use to create a new object without necessarily using a config file. You will see a lot of documentation and a lot of blog posts out there talking about kubectl create. Remember, we have not been using this command throughout this course because we've been taking the more declarative approach of using those config files. We're then going to designate the type of object that we want to create. So of course, we want to make a secret. And then we will designate the type of secret. Now, our type of secret is generic, which indicates that we are saving some arbitrary number of key value pairs together. There are two other types of secrets that you might create. The first one is a Docker registry. So you would put in Docker registry. The other type of secret you can make is TLS. And TLS is related to, say, HTTPS setup. And we would use the TLS right here to store a set of TLS keys. Now, the vast majority of the time, you are going to use the generic. We would use the Docker registry one anytime that we want to set up some type of authentication with a custom Docker registry that we would be storing our images in. Now, you and I are storing all of our images in Docker Hub, so no custom authentication is required, so we do not need to make a secret of type Docker registry. And then as far as that TLS secret, we actually might be setting up some HTTPS stuff later, so we might end up using that other type of secret at some point in time, but we'll see. Okay, so after generic, we'll then put down a name for the secret. The secret name is very important. It's very similar to the name property, so we've added to all of our other objects. The name property is going to be how we refer back to the secret at some point in time in the future when we actually want to consume it and make use of this secret inside of a pod config. Then the last two arguments on here are going to be from literal. So when we use -- from literal, that means that we're going to write out the information to be stored inside the secret in this actual command, as opposed to trying to write the secret information into a file and then load up all that secret data from the file. So because we are using from literal, we're going to add on our information as a key value pair at the very end of the command. You and I want to encode some environment variable called PG password, so we'll probably end up doing something like PG password equals, and then our actual password, whatever it might be. You know, for us, we'll probably keep it something simple like password 123 or whatever it might be. Okay, so that's the entire command. So let's flip over to our terminal. We're going to write this thing out. And again, I want to remind you that we're going to have to run this command locally in our machine. And when we eventually move off to production, we're going to have to run the same command again to create a secret on that new environment as well. So let's get to it. I'm going to flip back over to my terminal. I'm going to run kubectl create secret. We're going to make a type of secret called generic. The secret name will be PG password. Notice how we're doing this in lowercase here. So this is not the actual environment variable. It's not the actual secret. It's just the name of the secret. So we're going to eventually have to reference this thing in the future and say, hey, go pull some information out of the secret called PG password. We'll then do -- from literal. I'll zoom in here just to make sure it's nice and legible. There we go. So -- from literal, and then we're going to put down the actual key value pair that we want to encode. So I'll do PG password equals, I don't know, 12345 ASDF, whatever you want it to be. It's totally up to you. All right, so that's the entire command. So I'm now going to run this, and we'll see that the secret was created. And now just to verify that, yup, it was successfully created, and to look at the secret, we'll put in kubectl get secrets, like so. And it's going to tell us, all right, we've got a secret called PG password, and there's one key value pair inside there. And the key value pair is the PG password that we put in right here. All right, so that's it. We've now created a secret that is going to store our Postgres database password. So now the last thing that we have to do is wire up this secret to our server deployment. So we need to make sure that our server container knows about the secret and receives it as an environment variable. And then the other thing that we have to do that might be a little bit less obvious is that we have now created a database password that is something different than the default Postgres password, which is by default something like, I don't know, PG password or whatever it is. I forget it off the top of my head. So we need to make sure that we also update our Postgres deployment as well. We're going to update our Postgres container definition and tell it about the password that it should be using as its default check. So we want to override the image's default password that it sets up when it creates a copy of database inside that container and say, hey, use this password instead. And so anytime that someone tries to connect to the database, it's going to try to authenticate that connection with the password that we provide to it. So 2 places to wire up the secret. Let's take a pause right now, and we'll take care of both these things in the next section.